Well, hello everybody. A very warm welcome to this briefing session organised by Faith in Europe, which is a multi-faith organisation with associations with Churches Together in Britain and Ireland, Churches Together in England, and equivalent bodies in Wales and Scotland. And we have a committee which consists of representatives of the different faith traditions in the United Kingdom, plus a Jewish representative and a Muslim representative as well. And we've been looking at European questions in various organizational garb since 1961, when the predecessor committee of Faith in Europe was established. And so we've been going many years. We've had expertise from the academic community, from the church community, from government, and many different ancillary organizations. And we've covered a vast number of topics. If you want to find out what we've covered over the years, we're establishing a new website, which is just about to go into operation, not just yet. But you can look up on the briefing section and you can see all the different countries that we've covered over the years, including Ukraine on 3 or 4 occasions, Belarus a couple of times. We've looked at the Caucasus. We've had a variety of speakers, mainly from the academic community and specialists on the European subjects, spiritual, religious, political, economic and social. And so this is a very special session at a very difficult time in European affairs, not only because of what's been happening with the pandemic, but also with the political ramifications of the exit of Britain from the European Union. So I hope everybody who's receiving this broadcast is well. I've just heard since our committee meeting this morning that the area where I live, Colchester and Essex, is about to go into Tier 2, so that will have implications for us in our community, particularly for our family. We have 2 girls and their families living very close by us, but I hope this finds you all well. It's my great pleasure this afternoon to welcome to speak to us Ruth Dearmond, who is part of the War Studies Department at King's College London. She did an MA and a PhD at Essex University, which I've had past associations with. I know quite a few of the people that she did her studies with. And she did a first degree in English language and literature at Oxford, and studied further studies at Warwick. She currently is the program director for the MA in International Relations at King's. She's chair of the War Studies Undergraduate Assessment Sub-Board and deputy chair of the Faculty of Social Science Assessment Board, and convener of the department's Russian and Eurasian Security Research Group. What we wanted to ask Ruth to talk about with us is the whole question, very vexed question of the relationship between Russia as a state actor and its foreign policy and the near abroad, which I know has very different definitions. Sometimes it's said to include the CIS countries, sometimes other countries as well. But with great pleasure, I'm going to invite Ruth to talk to us about Russia and its neighbours, values, conflict, and the West. Ruth.
Thank you very much, David, and thank you very much for this invitation. It's a huge privilege and pleasure to be here today talking about this subject. Not least because I always like talking about this subject and welcome every opportunity to do so. I should begin by saying that thankfully, my admin roles have now changed. I've been released from most of the things that that I had previously done in terms of assessment and running the master's program. But my primary role is as a senior lecturer in post-Soviet security. And my main interests are in Russia's relationship with Europe, with the post-Soviet space, as we call it, and with the United States. And all these three kind of categories of relationships that Russia have really fit together. So the first kind of thing that I wanted to say is that we can't understand the relationship between Russia and the post-Soviet states, the other parts of the former Soviet Union, without understanding how that relationship connects to Russia's relationship with the West, with the European Union, and with the United States, those two in particular.
Could I just say, Ruth, sorry to interrupt you just a moment, if people would like to ask questions and formulate their questions during the course of our session, if you look at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a section called Q&A. If you press on that, you'll be able to write a question, which will then appear in front of Ruth and myself, and then we will be able to answer the questions at the end of Ruth's talk. Thank you.
So, is the volume correct? Can you hear me reasonably well? I suppose was my other question. David?
I can, yes.
Okay, good. So in order to really understand what's been happening in Russia's relationship with the post-Soviet states, which I'm sure if you've looked at the news recently, you will have seen is in a state of crisis in all various parts of the post-Soviet space. But in order to understand that, I do think that we need to do what people often fail to do, unfortunately, in the West, which is to go back and look at the roots of the difference between Russia and Europe, Russia and the US, and Russia and some of its post-Soviet neighbours. So I want to just take a few minutes to very briefly run through precisely why it is that Russia has become so hostile to Western states and Western institutions and Western ideas, and why that hostility has played out significantly in the post-Soviet states. So I think there are three factors in particular that have generated the kind of hostility that we can see in the relationship between Russia and the West now. Three factors on the Russian side. Perhaps the most important of them all, certainly the earliest one, is what happened to Russia in the 1990s, which often gets kind of neglected in contemporary Western analysis. So Russia in the 1990s, as many of you may remember, suffered terrible, terrible economic and social collapse, essentially. As the Soviet Union ended and the Soviet economic system was replaced by a very rapid move to a capitalist model, all the old safety nets of Soviet society collapsed. The economy collapsed, people lost their savings, their jobs, their homes, and corruption and criminality flourished on a huge scale in Russia. And this partly happened, one of the reasons that this happened was because the Russian presidency was occupied by Boris Yeltsin, who, again, many of you may remember, who for various reasons was extremely weak, both politically weak and towards the end of his time in power, physically weak. He was very ill. And this created a kind of power vacuum in the Russian presidency, into which rushed organized crime, the security services, the so-called oligarchs, the super rich. And so in the 1990s, ordinary Russians and a lot of Russian politicians came to think about democracy as a space of weakness, of economic failure, of corruption, of criminality, of weak government, of fraudulent democracy. And a perception grew up, because Western states and Western institutions had done so much to promote democracy in Russia and had personally supported Boris Yeltsin in many cases, and had pushed for economic reform very hard. A perception grew up towards the end of the 1990s that the West, and particularly the European Union states and the United States, had interfered in Russian politics and the Russian economy. They had interfered in order to keep Yeltsin in power, because Yeltsin was their ally. They had interfered to take away or encourage the removal of the social safety nets that had existed. And they had interfered to destroy the Russian economy, essentially. And so as time went on, a narrative developed that blamed the West for Russian weakness, Russian corruption, for a loss of social and ethical values, and that the West had done this deliberately in order to keep Russia weak. This had a couple of consequences. I mean, I should start by saying I'm not endorsing this view, I'm just setting out what it was and the fact that it became quite a widespread one. I think this had two main kind of types of result, a domestic and an international one. Domestically, it created a very understandable desire to replace this chaos and weakness and corruption with order. And so the idea of a strong president who could restore order and restore Russia's prestige took hold and became very widespread in the Russian population. And so really from the start, and for a very long time afterwards, from the start of Putin's presidency, there was enormous support domestically for Putin, for his role as a strong leader domestically who was restoring order, but also who was restoring kind of Russian values as well. And then internationally, the 1990s really produced a kind of distrust of the West that was quite widespread in the Russian population and very prevalent in the Russian political elite. An idea that that the West was using its strength, its political and military and economic and cultural strength, to interfere in Russia's internal affairs in order to keep it weak. And from this, I think we start to see the real split on values questions that has been such a striking element of the relationship ever since. At the same time, a kind of second really important issue occurred, and this was the expansion of NATO, which the Russian government was hugely opposed to, but was completely unable to prevent. The Russian political class thought that they had had assurances from the United States that NATO would not expand in the way that it did. And so this was seen as another betrayal. And in particular, once NATO started to expand into the territory of the former Soviet Union, when the Baltic states were incorporated into NATO, then it became seen as a really direct threat. And this threat became even more significant as a result of the third key issue, I think, for today's topic, which was the so-called colour revolutions. The colour revolutions were a sequence of three events, three revolts, perhaps would be a way to put it, protests against stolen and disputed elections. The first one was in Georgia in 2003, the second in Ukraine in 2004, and then in the Central Asian state of Kyrgyzstan in 2005. And in each case, popular opposition to a stolen election led to large-scale protests and to the overthrow of the government, or the blocking of the appointment of the person who had been fraudulently elected. And in each of these cases, the leadership of the countries was replaced by a leadership that appeared to be pro-Western, was very pro-Western in the case of Georgia, reasonably pro-Western in the case of Ukraine, and slightly less, but still a little bit, in the case of Kyrgyzstan. And this, given the United States government and the European Union's commitments to supporting democracy, which is written into foreign policy in both cases, these were developments that were strongly welcomed by the EU and by the United States. And the fact that they were so welcomed, and the fact that Western states had provided low-level technical assistance to develop democracy and human rights in these countries, these things were taken by the Russian government as evidence that the West was using what it came to call colour revolutions technology, which is that really their equivalent of our concerns, Western concerns about hybrid war, Russian hybrid war, if you've heard that term. So a sense that the United States and its European allies were using a pretended concern for democracy and human rights to overthrow uncooperative governments in the former Soviet Union and install client regimes in their place. So for them, the talk of democracy, human rights, and the support for the colour revolutions was kind of realpolitik masquerading as liberalism. And there was a huge concern that this would spread to Russia, that the West would attempt to do the same thing in Russia, and in other allied states. And so this led to several consequences, including a crackdown inside Russia on foreign-funded non-governmental organisations, a crackdown on the independent media, which was increasingly brought under state control, and a crackdown on the opposition, both on groups, but also on prominent individuals. And this extended to, very unfortunately, not only arrests for seemingly fairly arbitrary things, but also to violence. And you may have seen a few weeks ago the poisoning of Navalny, who is the most prominent opposition figure, Alexei Navalny, the most prominent opposition figure in Russia. So all of these things, I think, have an origin partly in a response to the idea that the Western states are trying to undermine the Russian government. It also, I think, led to a desire on the part of the Russian government for, to put it bluntly, payback, that if the West had interfered in Russia, so Russia was going to interfere in the West. And it's in that context, I think, that we need to understand Russian interference in Western elections and the use of propaganda and disinformation through media outlets like Russia Today. But perhaps most importantly of all, there was a strong desire to strengthen ties with friendly governments in the post-Soviet space. And there was an attempt to do this in a number of ways, to create Russia-led regional organizations, both military and economic, and political as well, to extend favorable trading arrangements, and particularly favorable kind of energy relationships, and to provide military and political and wider economic support for some of the weaker states with which Russia is allied. And examples of these include some of the states in Central Asia, Belarus and Armenia. Belarus and Armenia in particular have been particular kind of focus of Russian kind of bridge building attempts to reinforce the relationship. Where this hasn't worked, however, where the Russian government hasn't been able to build strong institutional and economic and military and political ties with its neighbours in the former Soviet Union, and indeed in other parts of former communist Europe, particularly the Balkans. So where the carrot hasn't been successful, the stick has been used as an alternative, as a means of preventing these countries from getting closer to the West, to the European Union, to the United States. So we can see, for example, that in order to prevent post-color revolution Georgia from joining NATO, Russia effectively engineered a war with Georgia in 2008, which removed any possibility that Georgia could ever join NATO, really, at least in the near future. And the annexation of Crimea in Ukraine and the ongoing conflict in eastern Ukraine also need to be understood in this context as a means to prevent Ukraine getting too close to the European Union and to NATO. And this has, as I said, also been evident outside the post-Soviet space, most in some states in Eastern and Southeastern Europe. And the most prominent example outside the post-Soviet space is probably the attempted coup in Montenegro, very small state of the former Yugoslavia, which was seeking to, and indeed has since, joined NATO. And in an attempt to prevent Montenegro joining NATO, there was an attempted coup backed by Russia. So that's the kind of context, and that's where I suppose you can start to see some of the broad outlines of Russia's involvement in the post-Soviet states. But all of this also takes place in the context of something I mentioned a few moments ago, which is the development of a conflict over values between Russia and the West. You know, of all the kinds of areas of dispute between Russia and the West in the 21st century, the dispute over values and norms has become one of the most acute. And this is because it's a two-way dispute. So the European Union, and to greater or lesser extent, the United States, depending on who's president, have a dispute with Russia over their values. And at the same time, Russia takes a very negative view of values in the European Union and the US, and is attempting to push back on those. So, you know, if we look at the European Union, I mean, the European Union, as I'm sure you know, has a very strong focus on political and ethical values written into its approach to foreign policy. It sees itself as a normative political actor in relation to states outside the European Union. And this has been most strongly evident, perhaps of all, in relation to the post-Soviet space, where it's supported for the whole post-Soviet period. It's supported the development of democracy and human rights, both through funding through supporting programs of various sorts, but also by strengthening ties. And as I said before, this is seen by Russia and continues to be seen by Russia through the prism of the 1990s and the Colour Revolution. So therefore as a threat, and as as a threat to Russian influence in the region, but also as an attack on Russia itself. And one of the main ways that Russia has tried to resist this attack, as it sees the situation, is by trying to strengthen its own value identity, its own identity as a kind of moral centre, and to establish itself as an alternative global leader on issues of values and morality. And this, I'm not a historian of Russia, so I hesitate to step into this territory, but this does link into an older historical view of Moscow as the so-called Third Rome, as a global leader of Christianity and an alternative centre of world civilization. And this has become an increasingly important element of Russian foreign policy in the 21st century, and particularly since Vladimir Putin's re-election in 2012, after a brief stint when he was Prime Minister, came back in 2012. And it's really at that point you can start to see a huge kind of strengthening of Russian governmental hostility towards the West. So as relations with the European Union and the US have declined since 2012, you can see an increasingly strong attack by the Russian government on the moral weakness of the West, which it sees not only as wrong in itself, but as actually responsible for Western decline. So a very strong element of kind of Russian foreign policy narrative has been that liberalism, social liberalism in particular, and atheism have corrupted and weakened Western states. It's actually most commonly, well, there are several elements to this that keep coming back. Certainly the Western kind of liberalization of views on homosexuality is often cited as a key cause for Western decline, Western weakness. But also the abandonment of Christianity, according to the Russian government. And so the Russian government has positioned itself as a defender of Christian values against a corrupt atheist West, and has reinforced the idea that it stands as a defender of a traditional social order, both in relation, again, to issues of homosexuality. So in 2013, the Russian government enacted a law against gay propaganda, as it called it, also the role of women in society. And so this is the kind of one of the Russian government's key normative positions and one of the key aspects of its contemporary foreign policy. I just wanted to quickly give a quick quote from Putin, because it exemplifies all of this. So in 2013, in a speech, he said that we can see how many of the Euro-Atlantic countries are actually rejecting their roots, including the Christian values that constitute the basis of Western civilization. They're denying moral principles and all traditional identities, national, cultural, religious, and even sexual. And people are aggressively trying to export this model all over the world. Without the values embedded in Christianity and other world religions, without the standards of morality that have taken shape over millennia, people will inevitably lose their human dignity. We consider it natural and right to defend these values. So this is the kind of Russian governmental position. And of course, it's found some common ground with conservative groups both in Europe and in particularly perhaps in the United States. Part of this focus on values has been the increasing significance of the Orthodox Church in Russian foreign policy identity. This is not to say, of course, that the Russian Orthodox Church is making foreign policy, but it constitutes an influence, I think, certainly a conceptual influence. And the personal relationship between Putin and the senior figures of the Russian Orthodox Church is kind of pretty well documented and seen as significant in that regard. But it's particularly important, of course, in relation to Orthodoxy and the other post-Soviet states, particularly Belarus and Ukraine, where both the Russian Orthodox Church and, in the last few years, the Russian government itself has promoted the idea of the so-called Russian world, a kind of civilizational link that unites Russian speakers and people of Orthodox faith, people who are kind of culturally Russian, particularly in Belarus and Ukraine. And this is an idea that emerged very strongly after the start of the conflict in Ukraine. I want to just talk about two conflicts in particular. It's slightly difficult. When I originally began to think about this this talk, it was not clear, kind of, because events move so fast in the region, it really wasn't clear what the kind of key issues were going to be. But I want to talk about Belarus and a little bit about Ukraine, and also very briefly about Nagorno-Karabakh. So it's always useful to actually see what we're talking about. So I just want to start by putting up a quick image of where it is that we are discussing. So this, which I hope you can see, is a map of Western Russia and along, and Europe, obviously, along Russia's western border. You can see at the top the small Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania, which are all members of NATO, members of the European Union. And immediately below them, there's the landlocked country Belarus, which sits on Russia's border. And also, very importantly, sits between Russia and NATO states in the Baltics and in Poland. And then below Belarus, there's Ukraine. You can only see the western part of Ukraine, the map has cut off, which sits again on the borderland between Russia and NATO and European Union states, and above the Black Sea, very important strategic area for Russia. So Belarus is, I shall stop this now. Belarus is not a country that many people thought a great deal about in the West until this year, wrongly, I think. It's come to attention in Western media as a result of the huge public protests over what is widely regarded as a stolen presidential election. So the current leader of Belarus, Alexander Lukashenko, who has been the authoritarian ruler of Belarus since the mid-1990s, had to go through what should have been for him the kind of routine pretense of an election, but he actually lost the election. I think it's generally agreed, but refused to concede and instead attempted to claim that he had won the election. And for the first time in Belarus's post-Soviet history, this brought huge protests out onto the street. One of the striking things about Belarus before now has been the extent to which the population hasn't engaged in widespread protest, despite the nature of the Belarusian dictatorship. So this is the first time that this has happened. And it's very, very striking, the scale of it, both the numbers of people who've come out onto the street and this is very bad news for Lukashenko, the fact that the protests really span society. So often, where there are traditionally where there have been protests in Russia, for example, they have tended to be younger, university educated often, people in the huge cities, particularly Moscow and St. Petersburg. What you see in Belarus now are people in towns across the country going out on strike, protesting in the streets. And it's really, the population from, university students to retired people to factory workers. And this clearly represents a very significant threat to the authority of the government of Belarus and to Lukashenko in particular. And he has responded by imposing really kind of brutal crackdown on the population, one that has got much worse, unfortunately. So only this week he has announced that he has authorized live bullets to be used against the protesters. Belarus, because of its position, as you saw from the map, is strategically very important to Russia. It's also seen, as I said, as part of this Russian world, as confessionally largely similar. And the Russian government, Putin, who has never personally liked Lukashenko, nevertheless clearly wants to keep him in power if that is possible, as long as it isn't damaging to Russian interests. And so this crackdown has been supported by Russia. Russia has provided financing for some of the measures. But Russia is, I suppose, the Russian government is prepared to, almost certainly prepared to countenance a different leadership in Belarus if one emerges that is sympathetic to Russia. In terms of the kind of values issue that I talked about, one of the significant features of what has happened is the way that it has exposed significant splits between, on this question, between the Belarusian Orthodox Church and the Catholic Church. There's a relatively kind of small but significant Catholic minority in Belarus, if I remember correctly, largely up in those regions of Belarus that border Lithuania. And the Catholic leadership in Belarus has spoken out very strongly against what has happened, and indeed has been prevented from returning to Belarus as a consequence. There's been condemnation from the Catholic leadership, and interestingly, the Russian government has suggested that this is because they are being told to say this, in effect, by the United States. So Catholic leadership criticism of Belarus has been described by the head of the Russian Foreign Intelligence Service as an attempt by the United States to interfere with the religious situation in Belarus and to set Orthodox and Catholic Christians against each other. The head of the Orthodox Church in Belarus has recently been replaced. The previous Metropolitan Pavel, who was replaced in late August, came under quite significant criticism domestically and internationally for fully endorsing Lukashenko and his election. It's very hard to see what happens in Belarus. It seems unlikely the protests are going to stop. Equally, it looks at the moment as if Lukashenko is not going to disappear. So it's really not clear what will happen. But at least in the short term, nothing that's likely to happen looks very positive, I think, for the people of Belarus. In the case of Ukraine, and just to go back as a quick refresher, so in the case of Ukraine, things are more intractable perhaps and more complicated. Russia in 2014 annexed the Crimean Peninsula, which had for a very long time been a majority Russian area anyway, a majority Russian area inside Ukraine. And it has supported, and a lot of people in the West would say instigated, a separatist conflict in Ukraine's eastern region, which again is largely Russian speaking and kind of Russian identifying, if you like. The Ukrainian government in Kiev, in the capital, so the main Ukrainian government, has attempted to build close relationships with the West, but while also attempting, I think, to maintain a working relationship with Russia, because they have no choice, in effect. I mean, they're Russia's neighbour, they're not going anywhere. But the relationship has not been good in recent years, and it's difficult to imagine that, that it's going to get any better, I think. And this dispute has spread, has spread out from a military conflict, even into, into areas of religion. So a couple of years ago now, I think, possibly last year, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church actually split from the Russian Orthodox Church as a response to the Russian annexation of Crimea and its activities in eastern Ukraine. So far from helping to create the Russian world that the church and the government have wanted to do, actually the conflict in Ukraine has had the effect, I think, of pushing more elements of Ukrainian society away from close cooperation with Russia. I very briefly want to touch, finally, on an ongoing conflict in the Caucasus region, which hopefully you can see on the map. And this is the conflict which, again, you've probably heard about in recent weeks, between Armenia, the small pro-Russian Orthodox country in the center of the map, and Azerbaijan, the much larger and much richer country on the Caspian Sea. This dispute has centered over the region of Nagorno-Karabakh, which lies on the border between Armenia and Azerbaijan, and which has for a long time had a predominantly Armenian population, but is part of Azerbaijani territory. In the early 1990s, the conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan actually resulted in an Armenian military victory, and so Nagorno-Karabakh for a long time has effectively been linked to Armenia and has not been under the control of the government of Azerbaijan. But this summer and this autumn, there has been an attempt by Azerbaijan to reclaim it. And this has meant, tragically, a resumption of an active phase of the conflict after really almost 25 years of the conflict having been frozen. It's a hugely disturbing conflict for many reasons. One of them, the most important, I think, is that it's a fundamentally intractable conflict. Armenia, or the Armenian government, and many Armenians see Nagorno-Karabakh as essential Armenian territory, as part of the birthplace of the Armenian people. And so they absolutely reject the idea that Armenia has no stake in Nagorno-Karabakh, that Nagorno-Karabakh is not Armenian. But equally, the Azeris, by and large, view Nagorno-Karabakh as essentially Azeri. And so, the precondition for any kind of conflict resolution necessarily is a willingness to compromise in some areas. But given that Armenia and Azerbaijan both regard this territory as essential to their national identity and their cultural identity, it's very hard to see how this can be resolved in any other way than military conquest, which will have terrible consequences for the population. All of this is made more complicated and more alarming, really, because of the interest of Turkey. Increasingly, this wasn't a feature in the 1990s, really, but Turkey has been supporting the government of Azerbaijan in this conflict. And because Armenia and Russia are linked not only culturally and economically, but they're linked in a collective security structure, which means in theory that if another country attacks Armenia on Armenian territory proper, that Russia has an obligation to give Armenia military support. So in theory, Turkish support for Azerbaijan, if the conflict expands, could, again in theory, lead to a conflict between Russia and Turkey. And of course, Turkey is a member of NATO. I don't actually think this will happen because neither Turkey nor Russia, I think, has any interest in a conflict, but it is nevertheless a concern. So I just want to finish by posing a question: is there any positive resolution to any of this? As I've said, we can see this kind of fundamental Russian kind of suspicion of the West, both generally and in the post-Soviet space, and this has motivated a lot of Russian activity in relation to the post-Soviet space. And this has become a kind of fundamental conflict over values, not just over kind of territory acquisition or membership of NATO. But one thing that has been suggested by one analyst who specialises in the role of the Orthodox Church, he suggested that actually there might be a potential role for contact between the Russian Orthodox Church and other faiths, other religious organisations in the post-Soviet space and in Europe, because he suggests that actually peacemaking is something strongly associated with religious organisations, and that actually this could be a point of contact not just for conflict resolution in the post-Soviet space, but generally for building cooperation and trust between Russia and the West. It's hard to see that happening in the short term, but it's certainly an interesting idea in the longer term. I think in the short term, really the only likelihood of change will come when different people occupy key roles, and certainly it's hard to see a major shift occurring while Vladimir Putin is still president of Russia. So I'm sure I've spoken for more than long enough. I will stop there.
Ruth, thank you very much indeed for that. I was particularly interested in the comparison, or potential comparison, between the situation in Nagorno-Karabakh and Kosovo, where the Serbs saw Kosovo Polja, the Blackbird Field, as being essential to definitions of Serbian nationhood, going back to the defeat of the Serbian allied armies to the Turks in the 15th century. The notion somehow of a particular piece of land being associated with the essence of a nation. And I'm particularly aware, my knowledge of Russian history, of the association between the soil, the land, the blood, and the faith. I think a term that was used and has been used quite a lot in Faith in Europe over the years, the notion of the canonical land, the close emotional ties. I was wondering whether you felt there was a similarity between the two.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are strong parallels with Kosovo, in the sense that it's about national identity tied to a particular bit of land, and the historical claims to that land. So, you know, the idea that, as I said, that these are they're essentialist claims. You know, this Nagorno-Karabakh is essentially and necessarily Armenian, but it's also essentially Azerbaijani. And this has been the major feature of the conflict, I think, for the whole of its existence. And it permeates all aspects of the discussion about the conflict, so much so that when I was doing my PhD, I went to do some research in Cambridge University Library, and I was looking at a book that mentioned Nagorno-Karabakh, and somebody had in pencil in Cambridge University Library, so a long way from Nagorno-Karabakh, written a kind of pro-Armenian comment in the margin about Armenia's claim to Nagorno-Karabakh, and then somebody else had come along and made a kind of pro-Azerbaijan claim underneath. It really I can't stress enough how profound this conflict is, and how intractable it is as a result, I guess, you know, as with Kosovo, really. Yes.
Thank you very much. Now, we have had a number of questions put to us, and I'll take them in the order in which they came in. First question, how much does the West understand the real Russian value system? I'll repeat that question. How much does the West understand the real Russian value system?
It's a very, very hard question to answer. And I mean, one of the problems in talking about this subject, I think, is that, you know, we use the term the West, you know, as a kind of straightforward one. And certainly it's one that the Russian government itself uses. Often when it talks about the West, really essentially it means the United States and what it thinks of as client states in Europe. So actually the West is a much more complex and multiple kind of structure than that would suggest. And so, I mean, elements of the West, by which I mean, you know, the European Union and the NATO countries, elements, I think, probably have a better understanding of the kinds of values that I was talking about than others. There's a tendency in Western analysis to see the Russian government's promotion of traditional values as not really genuine, as simply a kind of political maneuver to oppose Western democracy promotion, for example. You know, I can't speak to the genuineness of Putin. I wouldn't attempt to, I wouldn't presume to speak to the genuineness of Putin's kind of religious views, for example. But I mean, one of the striking things and the odd things about the relationship between Russia and Western institutions is that some of the countries whose governments appear to feel most deeply about the importance of traditional values are actually the ones who are most opposed to Russia. And the classic case of this is Poland. The Polish government, the current Polish government, shares, I think, many of the values that the Russian government has promoted, but it also is extremely hostile because of its history, extremely hostile to the Russian government. So there's a strange situation in which perhaps those bits of Europe that have the greatest amount of kind of values in common with Russia are the ones least willing to cooperate with Russia or engage in dialogue with Russia.
Thank you very much indeed. Now, a number of other questions have come in, but you can see them all. Just drill down a bit. I can only see 4, and they're all from the same person.
There are more. There's
I can't see. Yeah, I can't drill down somehow. Why didn't you answer one of the questions you can see on your screen, Ruth?
Yes. So, well, I wanted to just actually, yeah, go to a question below from Philip Walters, which is, has there been any suggestion either in Belarus or in Russia that Belarus should cease to be an independent country and become part of Russia? Very interesting question. So Russia and Belarus technically exist in a union. There has been a project to develop a union state of Russia and Belarus since, I think, the late 1990s, certainly since the early noughties. No, it was since the 1990s. And in the early phases of this project development, Alexander Lukashenko was strongly in favour of it. And the view of Western analysts was, some Western analysts at least, was that he was in favour of it because he thought that he could become the president of both Russia and Belarus, so that he could step up from just being the Belarusian leader to being also the leader of Russia. And this was during the Yeltsin period when the Russian government was very weak and maybe it looked feasible. But as soon as Putin came to power, he made it very clear to Lukashenko that Lukashenko was never going to get to be president of Russia. And Lukashenko became much less keen on the idea as a result. But this idea has still persisted. There's been a degree of military union. They are both members of the so-called Eurasian Union, which is largely economic. And I think there's a general view on the part of certainly Western analysts and Western observers that the Russian government would like to push ahead with closer integration, obviously Russian-dominated integration. Belarus would still technically be an independent state, so Russia wouldn't have to absorb, for example, the economic costs of Belarus. But that Belarus would be part of a really full union with Russia kind of running things. And there's, I think, a widespread view that actually, because Lukashenko has been opposed to this, actually getting him to agree to this has been the price that the Russian government have demanded for their support in the current crisis. So a lot of people are suggesting that Putin has essentially agreed to help Lukashenko deal with these protests as a way of getting him to agree to a union state, to a closer union in which Russia would be the senior partner.
Thank you very much. There is a question that's come in about these post-Soviet structures, such as the CIS. I'll read the question out. What has happened to the post-Soviet structures, such as the CIS, and how many post-Soviet states have a collective security structure with Russia, as Armenia does?
Yeah, so the there was a weird proliferation. Well, I don't know if it wasn't necessarily that weird in itself. There's a proliferation of post-Soviet structures in the period after the collapse of the Soviet Union. The main umbrella one was, as David Blackman has suggested, the CIS, the Commonwealth of Independent States. And under this, there were a huge number of kind of sub-organizations, but they were really only organizations on paper. There was an intention on the part of the Russian government in particular to give them kind of real meaning, you know, real substance. But in order for that to happen, the Russian government felt Ukraine needed to be a part. And right from the start of the post-Soviet period, the Ukrainian government was against the Commonwealth of Independent States, against entering into any organization that in which Russia was the dominant figure. So there are quite a few of these structures still in existence in the former Soviet Union, but none of them include Ukraine. And that means that for Russia, I think, none of them are really as significant as they should be, or they could be. But you have, as I said, the Eurasian Union, which is primarily economic. You have the Collective Security Treaty Organization, which is a military organization. I have to say in passing, given that I've talked about kind of competition with the West, that I think these names, you know, Eurasian Union sounding like European Union and Collective Security Treaty Organization sounding like the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, I don't think that's a coincidence. I think there's a kind of deliberate attempt to replicate or to counter Western structures. So they're still there. The membership fluctuates and their importance fluctuates as well. The Collective Security Treaty Organization includes Russia, Armenia, Belarus, and some of the states of post-Soviet Central Asia, although it's slightly hard to keep track of which ones because some of them leave and rejoin. So Uzbekistan has left and rejoined, I can't remember how many times. Turkmenistan has never been a member because Turkmenistan is a very curious, almost totally kind of isolated state in Central Asia. But Kazakhstan, the biggest, and Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan are all members. And the Collective Security Treaty Organization is really particularly focused on Central Asia. And the reason for that is, well, firstly, these are the states that are willing to cooperate with Russia. But also, I think, because of the other major challenge that Russia faces potentially in the future, and that's the challenge from China. So the Collective Security Treaty Organization has historically been seen as a way of keeping the Central Asian states militarily under the kind of umbrella of Russia and keeping Chinese military influence out. And I think that's been one of the major features of it, more up to now, more than the kind of collective security principle, which has never really properly come into operation before. But of course now in Armenia, there is a risk that it will.
Sticking with Central Asia, which I have particular interest in, Ruth, because I was there last year at the start of a trip right across China, including through Xinjiang province and Kashgar, right across China, via various transport means. And I'd been to Kyrgyzstan before and saw the presence of the Soviet military there in the Manas base, which of course the Americans have since taken over, plus a number of other Russian military training sites. Another question has come in, is Kyrgyzstan a totally different case from the ones you've described previously?
I think, yes, the short answer is. It's a very interesting case. I mean, it's politically, it's fascinating because it's often described as the only kind of near democracy in Central Asia. So the other Central Asian states are really kind of extreme autocracies, the most extreme of which is Turkmenistan, which I mentioned a moment ago, which is really, I suppose, run like a kind of non-communist, non-ideological North Korea. It's perhaps the closest example in terms of the cult of personality of the leadership. So the previous president, who died about 10 years ago, I think, built in the capital of Turkmenistan a enormous, giant, rotating golden statue of himself that rotated to face the sun. And this is a kind of extreme example, but that's the kind of that's more typical for Central Asia, perhaps, than Kyrgyzstan, which has had changes of non-violent changes of power. It's also had 3 now, I think, popular uprisings in which the government has been replaced as a result of disputes over elections in particular. It's not seen anymore by Russia as an area of threat from the West. I mean, it was very interesting that David mentioned the air bases in Kyrgyzstan, because during the noughties, during the war on terror phase, the question of air bases in Kyrgyzstan was a very significant one for the Russian government. So the Russian government, until that point, had not built any new military bases since the collapse of the Soviet Union outside the borders of Russia. But they chose to build one in Kyrgyzstan, and they chose to build an air base 30 kilometers down the road from the American air base. And it was obviously simply about checking American influence. So it's a different situation with a kind of complex and particular political culture. It's not subject, I think, to the same kinds of concerns about Western influence now as Ukraine and Belarus, and it's certainly not facing the same kind of essentialist crisis as Armenia and Azerbaijan over Nagorno-Karabakh. So it is important. I think it's important to recognise that this kind of conflict, or this kind of uncertainty or turmoil, the removal of the government, it is part of a kind of longer history of this kind of activity in the country. So it's not, it's very significant for the region, it's significant for Kyrgyzstan, but I don't think it will have the same impact that, say, what's happening in Belarus or what's been happening in Ukraine has done.
Thank you very much. Now, a question has come in about the impact of the Soviet period on Putin. Where, says the question, does the Soviet communist period fit into Putin's viewpoint?
Very, very interesting question. This is a contested subject, perhaps not surprisingly. One of the comments of Putin's that is most widely repeated by Western politicians, Western commentators, is his comment of a few years ago that the collapse of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical tragedy of the 20th century. I think that's been misunderstood slightly as a comment. I don't think that Putin was calling for a return to the USSR. But it's clear, I think, that Putin thinks, partly because of what happened in the 1990s, as I said, that Russia needs to return to its position in the Soviet period when it occupied this kind of privileged status in the Soviet Union. It was the dominant part of the USSR. And I think from what Putin has said and the way that the Russian government has acted while he has been president, we can see that that there are elements of the Soviet period to which he would like to return, with which he finds sympathy. So I think it's very significant. It's also significant in the way that, Putin and his government have used bits of Soviet history to establish Russia's kind of civilizational importance, its historical importance, and a distinct kind of Russian identity in opposition to the West. And the key part of that is the focus on the Second World War, the Great Patriotic War, which has become a really key kind of touchstone issue for the Russian government. The Russian government has promoted particular interpretations of the Second World War. They've backed films, particular kind of historical films about the Second World War that promote a very kind of patriotic, pro-Russian, but also pro-Soviet viewpoint. And they are attempting to criminalize what they describe as kind of false history around the Second World War. So, I mean, the role of the Second World War is important. I think the role of kind of Soviet strength for Russian identity is important for Putin. And of course, you know, as particularly Western politicians like to point out very often, you know, Putin was an officer in the KGB. He was stationed in East Germany when the Soviet Union collapsed. So he's had a kind of longish institutional life inside the Soviet security apparatus, and that, I think, certainly has had as it inevitably must have done, a kind of legacy effect on how he views the world. As I said, I don't think that means that he is a communist, and clearly no communist would seek to become as wealthy as he is. I don't think it means he wants to actually recreate the Soviet Union as a political entity, not least because that would be enormously expensive. And you know, one of the things that really weakened the Soviet Union was the economic drain of supporting both its neighbours in Eastern Europe and the poorer bits of the USSR. So I don't think he wants to kind of recreate the Soviet Union in that way, but a kind of network of friendly allied states that share certain values is something he clearly wants, and that is quite Soviet, I suppose.
Thank you very much indeed. Now, one of our members has quite a strong Belarusian connection, not least because of links with the Chernobyl and looking after refugees from Chernobyl. And her question is, my Belarusian friends in their fear are frustrated that the Western governments are not helping in a practical way. Are they perhaps helping behind the scenes?
Yes, it's very difficult. The European Union is imposing sanctions in response to what's happening in Belarus. So, I mean, there is certainly that. As you may have seen, the woman who is thought to have won the Belarusian elections, Tikhanovskaya, has been doing the rounds of Western governments, Western capitals, talking to various European leaders, attempting to kind of, I think, to get support for what's happening. And it's not clear at this stage exactly, you know, what is going on. Although the fact that the European Union are now willing to impose sanctions is indicative, I suppose, that this is being partly successful. But yeah, I mean, Western governments are just not doing a great deal. And I don't know if this is, I mean, it must partly, I suppose, be because the pandemic is having such a kind of terrible effect on all countries, and that makes it difficult to do other things. You know, there are other priorities. There's also, I suppose, the problem of what exactly Western governments can do, because, you know, if Belarus had been more closely connected to the European Union, then it would be much easier to do things that would have a meaningful effect on the government. But the Belarusian leadership has been much more closely tied to Russia, although, as I said, Lukashenko and Putin don't particularly like each other. And that means that, you know, that kind of penalties become quite hard, you know, where there are weak links. It's hard to do a great deal in response. And I mean, certainly I don't think anybody would contemplate any kind of military action, and that would be disastrous in all sorts of ways. And I don't think would be supported by the Belarusian population, to be honest. So actually determining what it is that Western governments can do is extremely difficult. I mean, I think it will be interesting to see if this changes. Certainly the kind of pressure on Belarus changes in some way if there is a change of US president next month, because, well, he won't come in. If there is a change, it won't happen next month, of course, but from January next year. Because the American government has not really been very vocal about Belarus, as they haven't about all manner of kind of human rights and democracy issues in Russia and the former Soviet Union during the Trump presidency. So there may be more pressure if there's a different US president, but again, it's difficult to see what Western governments can do in a sense, because I mean, sanctions, you know, are a welcome step, obviously, But actually, you know, where, given that Lukashenko's concern is almost existential, it's you know, he needs to stay in office. I think that's his basic point of view. Then anything that the West does is kind of trivial in comparison with the threat posed by him leaving office. So there needs to be a very, very strong incentive to get him to go, and it's hard to see what that is. I think one thing that is important is that, and actually I heard one of the members of the Belarusian leadership, opposition leadership, say this a couple of weeks ago, that, you know, ordinary people in the West and groups, you know, kinds of civil society groups, need to be raising it with their politicians, with their MPs, with the government, to keep putting pressure on Western governments to take this seriously. And I think that's an important thing to do.
Thank you very much indeed. Now we have a question from Pastor Paulina, originally from Poland, from the Lutheran Church in Great Britain, and she asks, is there any visible cooperation between the churches in the post-Soviet countries? It was mentioned that working on peace would be a great project. Is there anything happening towards it right now?
Not that I'm aware of, and I should say, you know, this isn't my primary area of focus, so there may be things happening that I don't know about, but it doesn't seem to me to be something that's particularly obviously occurring at the moment, and it's certainly not helped. The prospects for it are not helped by, as I said, the fact that the conflict in Ukraine has actually split the Orthodox Church in between Ukraine and Russia, and the fact that what's happening in Belarus seems to have produced a more acute split between the Orthodox Church there and the Catholic Church. So I think in order for that to happen, there needs to be some kind of closer cooperation or reconciliation between the churches in these countries, perhaps even before Western churches can be involved. But I don't know. I mean, I agree with, I personally think that this is a, you know, it's a powerful idea, and it's something I think that should be happening. Of course, one of the potential checks or constraints on it is that because the Russian government has this tendency to see Western interference everywhere, that even if churches and other faith groups from Europe reached out and attempted to establish cooperation with, say, the Orthodox Church, in the current climate, that might just be seen as an attempt to interfere, an attempt to undermine. I don't know, but it's a risk. I mean, it may be a risk that's very worth taking.
Could I just make one little comment on this? In the 60s and 70s and 80s, there were quite a number of umbrella organizations in Eastern Europe which had the word peace. These were quasi-Christian, quasi-Soviet government organizations which had the word peace in their titles, Christian peace movements, Christians for Peace, and so on. Very often these were groups of fairly pliable Christian organizations, supported and encouraged by Moscow, by the Politburo, and they just created something of a distrust amongst a lot of Christian organizations. I remember we used to have discussions about this in the predecessor organizations to Faith in Europe. There was a particular organization in Prague which promoted very much the sort of Soviet view of peace. So that may have compromised, to some extent, people's understanding and trust of any Russian attempts to use mere peace as a vehicle for integrating Christians. Just a thought, just a comment, really.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I wonder if enough time has now passed since then that there's the possibility to overcome that. But absolutely, that is a significant factor. So there would need to be, I suppose, trust would need to be built on both sides, on the Russian side and but also on the Western side. Yeah.
Now there's a question that's come in about Nagorno-Karabakh. Is Nagorno-Karabakh pretty well exclusively Armenian Christian, or is it much more mixed Armenian Azeri?
Unfortunately, and I think this is because of the nature of the conflict and the way it's tied into identity. There has, and this goes back to David's comparison with Kosovo as well, unfortunately, the ethnic cleansing has been a feature of, a significant feature of this conflict on both sides. So it, until recently, and well, up until now, it has been pretty well, I think, entirely Armenian Christian, since the Armenian side kind of gained control of it in the 1990s. And the Azeri government has, I think, in recent days made noises about, you know, made assurances that there wouldn't be ethnic cleansing. But of course, you know, if they succeed in taking Nagorno-Karabakh back. But unfortunately, I don't think anyone believes them. And, you know, because people have died in the current conflict, because the Armenian government have shelled territory in Azerbaijan outside Nagorno-Karabakh, and because the Azeri forces shelled the Armenian Orthodox cathedral last week, I think, in Nagorno-Karabakh. You know, all of this is increasing hostility, and people are now, I think, so locked into their positions, and including, unfortunately, seeing each other really fundamentally as the enemy, that if the Azeri government is successful in taking it back, I would expect that Armenian population really to be pushed out in its entirety. So for now, it's essentially Armenian Christian. If the government of Azerbaijan take it back, I would imagine that all those people will be displaced, unfortunately.
Thank you. Now, a question about a country which we haven't much referred to this afternoon. Philip's asking, what is the current relationship between Russia and Georgia?
Complicated is the short answer. Yeah, so Russia and Georgia have had this very, very difficult and complicated relationship since the Soviet Union collapsed, and this is largely because the Russian government has seen, right from the start of the post-Soviet period, has seen Georgia as what they call an area of Russian strategic interest. Because, and I will just actually put the second map back for a second. So if you look at where Georgia is, you know, it sits between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea, both of which are very strategically important for Russia. And then it also sits, you know, immediately below Russia and immediately above Turkey. It borders Turkey and is very close, really, to Iran as well. So it occupies this enormously sensitive space. And so the Russian government has always tried to prevent Georgia from fully breaking away, from becoming fully independent, and from joining Western institutions. And one of the things that it has done in order to achieve this is support secessionist movements in Georgia, in two regions in the north of Georgia, both of which border Russia. South Ossetia, which was the subject of the war in 2008, and Abkhazia, which is on the Black Sea coast and actually accounts for 1/3 of Georgia's Black Sea coast. These breakaway regions are now militarily tied to Russia. They're in a kind of military union with Russia, and many of their citizens are now also Russian citizens. So it's really made it impossible for Georgia ever to have territorial integrity, which means, amongst other things, that it's impossible for Georgia to join NATO. It's closer to the European Union, but still, you know, it's far too kind of troubled to ever really be a candidate for accession, I suppose. But the current Georgian government is obviously very keen on developing good relationships with the West. The current Georgian government sees the Black Sea as its critical space, both for security and for economy, rather than thinking of itself as a state of the Caucasus and as, you know, a state that's tied in these various ways to Russia. It wants to treat the Black Sea really as a kind of highway to Europe and the West that will allow it to establish good trade relations with Western states and stronger military links. So obviously none of this is popular with Russia. So Russia and Georgia are not in a phase of active conflict, but the two governments clearly do not get on. Nevertheless, you know, all Georgian governments, except for the government of Mikhail Saakashvili, who was in power when the 2008 war began, he's a very odd character and is running for president again in peculiar circumstances. Is a strange individual. But apart from him, you know, all the Georgian leaderships since the end of the Soviet Union have been very careful to strike a balance between improving relations with the West and not antagonizing Russia too much. Because Georgia, as you know, is this small, geographically small country with a small population. It's not a wealthy country. And it's the immediate neighbor of a nuclear superpower that is the world's largest geographic state with a population many, many times greater than Georgia's, and is a much richer state as well. So it's always had to be careful in its relationship. So it's not a positive relationship, but it's not an actively hostile one at this stage.
Thank you. Now, a very different sort of question has come in. I don't know whether you can unravel this, Ruth. Is the tension between the Orthodox and other churches part of the, I suppose, inverted commas, Marxist educated priests in the Orthodox Church?
Now that is something that I'm afraid is beyond my sphere of competence. I mean, clearly there are fault lines, and you can see a degree of I suppose of shared position, shared worldview between, on the one hand, the Russian Orthodox Church, the Belarusian Orthodox Church, and the government of Vladimir Putin, which, as we were talking about earlier, has these kind of links to the Soviet past. So, I mean, I don't think that's to say that these are kind of ex-Soviet figures or are themselves kind of Marxist in any way. So the short answer is I don't know, but certainly, you know, figures in the Russian Orthodox Church in particular clearly have significant links to the Russian government, which in turn, you know, has this kind of Soviet legacy. That probably doesn't answer your question, I'm afraid. Sorry about that. You have to excuse me for a moment. I just need to draw the curtain behind me because I can see it's blinding the screen. So give me 1 second. That's better.
Okay, now this is a question about Russian opposition figures. Do Russian opposition figures like Navalny and Fergal criticize Russian foreign policy, i.e. the near abroad, or do they concentrate more on internal politics?
I mean, it depends to a significant extent on the individual, right? So But there is a tendency amongst certainly American politicians and British politicians and some other European politicians to kind of group all of Russian opposition figures together and to think that because they are anti-Putin, anti the Russian government, that they must therefore necessarily be pro-Western or against what the Russian government is doing in other countries. And I don't think that's necessarily correct, right? So Navalny is not a kind of pro-Western person necessarily. The focus of his opposition is domestic, overwhelmingly domestic, and I mean, it will be interesting to see if his position changes now after what's happened to him, given that he's, presumably developing connections with the West more now than he has in the past. But in general, I would say that certainly Navalny is primarily concerned with Russian domestic issues. So, yeah.
Thank you. Now, a question is coming about whose side in the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict. Since Turkey supports Azerbaijan in the conflict over Nagorno-Karabakh, does Iran necessarily support Armenia?
Yeah, it's a good question. No, I think is the answer. I mean, Iran has a very complicated relationship with Azerbaijan. It's been a relationship of suspicion mostly. And this is not just because of the relationship with Turkey, but actually the primary reason, I would say, for Iran's problematic relationship with Azerbaijan is that the region of northern Turkey, northern Iran that adjoins Azerbaijan, is also Azeri. And so the government of Iran, since the collapse of the Soviet Union, have been very anxious to varying degrees, about the possibility that their Azeri region may attempt to secede and join up with Azerbaijan, or that Azerbaijan may incite this, which I don't think is tremendously likely, but nevertheless it's been a concern. But no, I don't think, Armenia is a very, very staunchly Orthodox country. It's both the country, I think certainly in Europe and the former Soviet Union, but possibly almost in the world, the country with the highest degree of kind of mono-nationality. So something like 96% of the people who live in Armenia are Armenian, and they are all pretty much Armenian Orthodox members or believers. That's always going to make a relationship with Iran difficult, right? I mean, given the strongly religious character of both countries, and the fact that these are not really compatible, the character of these countries. So no, I think Iran is not actively involved in this conflict at the moment, as far as I'm aware. A lot of countries around the conflict, and countries potentially with an interest, including the United States and European Union states, are not getting involved, not actively getting involved. They will want to be involved possibly in contributing to peace negotiations, possibly to observing to peace missions, peacekeeping even, perhaps. They're probably not. But really the only states outside Armenia and Azerbaijan themselves that have got involved have been Turkey and Russia, and the Russian role has been much less one-sided and much more ambiguous than the Turkish role.
Just to follow up on the conflict, question about Azeri enclaves in Armenia. Is there not at least one ethnic Azeri enclave in Armenia, which used to be regarded as a possible counterweight to the Nagorno-Karabakh in any peace deal?
I think this refers to, I'm just going to go back to the map temporarily. I don't know if you can see immediately above Iran on the map, there is a region that's separated by a line, a region between Armenia and Iran. And that is actually an Azeri exclave. It's technically part of Azerbaijan. And so I think that, you know, some Western people have occasionally suggested that maybe there should be or could be some kind of trade-off, that you know, the Armenian population in Nagorno-Karabakh could go there, and the Azeri population there could go to Nagorno-Karabakh. I can't see that actually happening because, well, not least because the Azeri government regards both of these regions as its territory, so it's not going to want to give one of them up. And again, because the Armenian government regards Nagorno-Karabakh as so fundamentally important to its identity, I don't think it's going to be willing to trade either.
Could I ask a question, Ruth, about the Ukraine, particularly about the Donbass area, the largely Russian ethnic area? I remember being very, very aware of just how powerful Russian ethnic sentiments were when I went to a football match between Arsenal and Shakhtar Donetsk a number of years ago. And I don't think I've ever been in such a cauldron-like atmosphere at Highbury. It's always known as Highbury the Library because the supporters weren't very activated, as it were, unlike the Kop, say, in Liverpool. But I remember the Shakhtar Donetsk supporters were very, very vocal, very, very powerful, brought their drums, and one appreciated, you know, the extent of the nationalist feeling, a little bit like PAOK Salonika, a football team that was supported by a group of Greeks who'd come from Turkey during the population exchanges after the First World War. What do you think, given the level of emotive feeling in certain sections, I'm not saying in all sections of the ethnic Russian section of the Donbass area, what do you think the likely scenario is? What's the likely outcome for that conflict?
Yeah, it's difficult because, as you say, I mean, this is an area that has historically had a strong kind of Russian identity, Russian language identity. And in the period immediately after the collapse of the Soviet Union, when there was anxiety in a number of the post-Soviet states about further disintegration, so Russia was worried that it itself would start to disintegrate, and other states were as well. I think there was huge concern in the early 1990s that that inside Ukraine and on the part of Ukrainian politicians, that the divisions between Western and Eastern Ukraine, between people who thought of themselves really as Ukrainian-speaking Ukrainian nationalists and people who thought of themselves as Russian Ukrainians, or Ukrainian Russians who were Russian-speaking, who in the early 90s, you know, identified more with the old Soviet system than with an independent Ukraine. There's huge concern that that this would lead to the kind of conflict we have now. And so actually, I think there was a lot of care taken to prevent that happening. And that got forgotten, I think, to be blunt, or people started to take it for granted, perhaps. But it you know, it's difficult to see a way out of this in some ways because the splits are so significant now, and you know, because the fighting has gone on for so long and so many people have died. But you know, Eastern Ukraine is not going to be able to become an independent state, right, or a pair of independent states. It really depends entirely on the Russian government for support. So, you know, if if at some point the Russian government is actually committed to or willing to take seriously a kind of peace process in eastern Ukraine, then I think probably, despite the strong feelings of a lot of people in that part of Ukraine, there would have to be some kind of political reconciliation at least. And you know, some people in Ukraine have suggested that a kind of federal structure might be a way to deal with this. You know, that you know, to give the eastern Ukrainian territories greater autonomy, but within a Ukrainian political, overarching Ukrainian state, Ukrainian political system. Ukrainian nationalists have been strongly opposed to this, often because they don't want to see any autonomy for eastern Ukraine. I think that would potentially be a solution, but it would require both the political will on the part of the Ukrainian government to kind of talk round or talk down its nationalists, and the Russian government being properly committed. And I think for that to happen, the Western states would have to agree, I think, to decouple the Eastern Ukrainian conflict from the issue of the annexation of Crimea, because the Russian government is never, I think, going to give up Crimea, right? As long as there's a Russian government in anything like its current form, Crimea is never going to be returned to Ukraine. And so in order to actually see any kind of reconciliation or conflict resolution in eastern Ukraine, Western states, I think, probably would have to agree to treat the two issues separately. This doesn't necessarily mean that they would have to agree, and I absolutely don't think they should agree, to recognise Crimea as part of Russia. But it could mean that they take the approach that actually Western states took in relation to the Baltic republics during the Soviet Union, because Western states never recognised Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania as part of the Soviet Union. They always regarded them as occupied states that had been occupied during the Second World War, and as far as European and American governments were concerned, had never been part of the USSR legitimately. But that didn't prevent Western governments attempting to engage with the Soviet government on a whole range of other issues. And so I think there would be a possibility for Western governments to take that approach, but that would be politically difficult for them, because anything that looked as if the Western governments were kind of giving up on Crimea would be difficult. So I think it's possible, but it's never going to satisfy everyone, and I don't think it will address the kind of identity splits in Ukraine. It would have to be a political solution that could accommodate those differences.
Thank you very much. Now, back to the question that you explored in your talk. How much does the West understand the real Russian value system? I should say that this question has value system in capital letters.
Yeah, again, I think, as I may have touched on before, perhaps not. If by that we mean the system, the value system as explained by, as promoted by the Russian government, then I think there's an understanding of it as a kind of political instrument, that they think of it as something that the Russian government uses in order to oppose the West, in order to oppress its own population. So it's a kind of simplistic understanding of it. But it's also true, of course, that we shouldn't assume that the values as established by or promoted by the Russian government are the values of all Russians, and of course they're not. And one of the kind of striking features of Russian society is that young people take quite different views, in large part from those of the Russian government. They tend to be more open towards the West. They often well, certainly some of them may have studied in the West, travelled in the West. So that I would be careful about thinking of a single value system. I don't think there is necessarily one, except the one being promoted by the Russian government, which is a slightly separate issue.
Thank you. I suppose there's a follow-up question to that. What can the West do to neutralize the differences in value systems without harming itself?
Yeah, it's a really tough question. Dialogue is always a good thing, I think. Even when, and perhaps particularly when, you fundamentally disagree with the people that you're talking to. I think that's quite clear from the current political situation in Britain and America and elsewhere, apart from Russia. So establishing channels of dialogue is always really important. And I think finding areas of common ground, even if they're not common ground, not areas of common ground in relation to values, but just finding areas where Western states and Russia can interact with each other in a non-hostile way is going to bring the temperature down, and that will bring the temperature down on matters of values as well. This was something that the Obama administration in the US tried to do in 2009, 2010. It basically said, well, look, we have this major disagreement on values, we have this very poor relationship with Russia at the moment. So, we want to find areas of common ground where we can talk to each other. And so they came up with this idea of a reset. They were going to press the reset button on relations with Russia and find shared areas of interest, which turned out to be things like signing a new nuclear arms reduction treaty, or signing or adopting a common position, more or less, on sanctions against Iran. So various things like that. And they also tried to set up a kind of bureaucratic structure called the Bilateral Presidential Commission, which was designed to bring Russian governmental and American governmental structures together to basically get bureaucrats to talk to each other on a regular kind of routine basis on comparatively low-level issues, things like, trade, but also agriculture and culture and law and order, a variety of things. And I think it was really designed to create stability, to give a kind of non-confrontational kind of bedrock to the relationship. And I think if something like that could be recreated, I don't know if that's possible now at the moment, but if it could, that might help to kind of lower the temperature in the relationship, and that in turn would perhaps take some of the heat out of the discussion of values. That if Russia and Western states actually got to a position where they could talk about really dull, routine, everyday stuff without it being a source of conflict, then issues like the promotion of human rights, for example, might seem like less of a contentious issue, less of a direct threat to Russian power.
Thank you. Now we're coming towards the end of our time. We've got about 8 minutes left. If I may, I might ask the final question, Ruth. In an article, I don't know how you feel about this. I'm referring to an article you wrote for The Guardian some 6 years ago. It was about Russia's motivations in the Ukraine. And you said that those who think that Russian actions in the Ukraine are a neo-imperialist land grab are mistaken. But you said, does Russia want to maintain its status as a great power? And I think back of Churchill and Stalin and Roosevelt at Yalta. Seems so 20th century now to see these three figures from the US, Britain and Russia. And I think of Johnson, and I think of Trump, and I think of Putin. Great power status, desire by Putin, global Britain by Johnson, make America great by Trump? Am I making conclusions which are too exaggerated? Is that true? Is it particularly true of Russia, I guess?
Is it particularly true of Russia? No, I mean, I think it's that, as you seem to be suggesting, there's a kind of global phenomenon there. You know, in relation to Ukraine and you know what I said in 2014, and as I think I said earlier on this afternoon, you know, I really don't think that the Russian government has ever been concerned to, you know, take more territory just in and of itself, you know, for its own sake. The Russian government has always been more concerned to maintain its influence and to expand its influence where it can. But that, you know, in the 21st century doesn't require normally, you know, invading another country, annexing territory. Crimea was a very particular case for all sorts of reasons, not least because Russia had a very large naval, and still has, a very large naval base on the Crimean Peninsula, which it wanted to secure. And it was, I think, the annexation was much more about that than it was about some long-standing desire to take back Crimea, which, frankly, you know, had the Russian government wanted to do, it could more easily have done perhaps in the 1990s, when the Crimean Parliament actually voted to secede from Ukraine and to join Russia. So, yeah, I mean, I think the interest on the part of Russia is in securing Russian interests and identity and extending Russian influence. In the case of Donald Trump and the Make America Great Again kind of slogan, that seems to be, you know, almost the opposite, actually, that the aim is to look inwards, not to look outwards, not really that concerned about American influence, except, you know, where trade interests are concerned, for instance. But you know, Trump personally, and his government a little bit less so, but particularly Trump personally, has really withdrawn from areas of influence that America has traditionally had, particularly in relation to NATO, of course, but also to some extent in East Asia. You know, so areas that perhaps, you know, Putin would seek to exploit if he were in the position, you know, to expand influence, extend influence. Actually, Trump has withdrawn from influence, I think, and that's I think if there's a change of American government, they're going to try and undo that. But certainly a lot of damage has been done to American influence in Europe and elsewhere.
Thank you very much indeed. Well, I think we've come towards the end of our time. So can I say, Ruth, many, many thanks for giving up an afternoon to discuss such exciting and interesting questions. It also gives us a little bit of a break from our preoccupation nationally with the pandemic, give us perspective on other things and other people, and to make us aware that there is another part of Europe which isn't necessarily that which is being presented to us on the media. So can I say very many thanks to you. Very many thanks also to those who've asked questions. And finally, very many thanks to CCBI, to Romina and to Dave for setting this up technologically. I hope it's been a success for everybody. I've certainly enjoyed it very much. And thank you all for attending. Many, many thanks.
Thank you.